I think we'll get going. I see there's a nice chat going on already, so that's wonderful to see. Thank you all for coming out virtually. First of all, I would like to begin by noting that Yale University rests today on the land and territories of indigenous folks, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scoticoke, Golden Hill Pagosset, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples. The history of Yale as an institution is inseparable from broader histories of imperialism and settler colonialism, and I want to acknowledge this at the beginning. My name is Swagato Chakravorty, and I'm a PhD candidate at Yale in History of Art and Film and Media. I work on late modern and contemporary art and visual culture broadly, and my dissertation is a cross-cultural study of displacement and form in contemporary art, in particular time-based media with a focus on South Asian and African diasporic cultural production. I've held curatorial positions at the Museum of Modern Art, the New Museum, and the Jewish Museum in New York. Currently, I serve as the Public Humanities Fellow in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. So many thanks to Public Humanities at Yale for sponsoring this series of conversations that I am programming throughout the term. Thanks in particular to Karen Rothman, Senior Lecturer in Humanities, English, and American Studies, and also the Associate Director of the Public Humanities Program. I also want to acknowledge Matt Jacobson, William Robertson Co-Professor in American Studies, African American Studies, and History at Yale, who's here in the audience today. Matt, thank you for being here today, for the material support that you've provided and for your ongoing interest in these conversations. When Matt and Karen invited me to put together this series, I saw an opportunity to put my own research and professional commitments in the arts and culture in conversation with the broader remit of the public humanities, responding to the multiple crises, national and international, that we navigated throughout 2020, the after effects of which continue to ripple outward. I wanted to bring together a range of folks working in different capacities at cultural organizations. All of whose work is either public facing or takes up matters in the public interest. And my hope is that over the course of this term, these conversations will generate ways in which we may reconsider the intersections of culture and its very publics, hence the title of the series, which is Culture in its Publics, with particular attention to the question of what our cultural organizations and institutions can and need to do in order to move beyond the rhetoric of diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility that has been deployed so smoothly in a way. How do they actually become more equitable? How can we actually narrate the histories of American arts, culture, and the humanities? Given all of that, I am therefore delighted and honored to be in conversation today with Kijo Lee. Lee is Director of Academic Affairs and Associate Curator of Special Projects at the Cleveland Museum of Art, an institution that she joined in 2017 as Assistant Director of Academic Affairs. She oversees and guides all of CMA's programs dealing with scholarly engagement with the collections, develops programming for graduate and undergraduate students to engage deeply with the humanities and with museums, and oversees the CMA's academic institutional partnerships. Her expertise is in American art history, the history of photography, African American studies, and museums and pedagogy. As such, she leads curatorial and publications projects at the crossroads of academic work and public audiences to highlight works in the collection by artists of the Black diaspora. In addition, Kijo is affiliated with African American Studies and History of Art at Yale and is completing her dissertation titled Precarious Matters, Photography, Physics, and Blackness. Kijo, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Swagato, and thank you to the Public Humanities at Yale, as well as everyone who made time to be here today.
You wear many hats in your current position. Your work is interdisciplinary, it is intersectional, it addresses academic, art historical, and wider audiences. In the best ways possible, you connect art with the public. I'd love to know something about how you came to be here doing what you're doing now.
So there are a few people in the audience that I know me, so they're unsurprised to say that I wear many hats in my new position. I think that in many ways, my pathway into art history was unorthodox, and into museums was a little bit unorthodox, and my position now is a bit unorthodox. So I was an older student. I didn't go to undergrad until I was 30, and then went right into the PhD program at Yale, and in history of art and African American studies. And I've always been driven to follow my own intellectual star. And it's what I hope to provide for students and my colleagues, right? So making these broad connections, having so many experiences outside of the academy that I brought into that space. And so not to be too long-winded, but how I landed in my position now, it wasn't the ways of going on the job market and seeing a position listing. And in many ways it was, I talk a lot about the things that I'm interested in and thinking about. And I did a lot of different things while at Yale. So any kind of, I TA'd for a course in aesthetics out of the philosophy department, as well as the survey, as well as a couple of seminars. I did the Associates in Teaching program, but co-taught a course with Hazel Carby that blended the thinking about Black womanhood between visual culture and literature, right? Interned with Pam Franks, who was the former deputy director, but also in the American Art Curatorial department. So, and always talking about these strange juxtapositions that I might see, as well as the investment in the one-on-one transformations that happen when you are talking about a work of art with an audience. So I can't underestimate the power of being a Wordle Gallery teacher as a part of this trajectory. So really understanding the pedagogy of art education, which is not something that we necessarily get when we're being trained as future faculty. So being able to drill down or teach complex conceptual art to a kindergartner assists me in thinking about how I can explain how quantum physics impacts my understanding of photography, right? And so all of that talking led me to being asked to participate in lots of study groups and working groups. And I want to think broadly about this or that, and happened to be the former head of education at the Center for British Art, who moved on to the Cleveland Museum of Art, was interested in having a role that could speak equally well to curatorial, education, and the public. So internally and externally, as well as the academy, because the CMA has a 50-year joint program in art history with Case Western Reserve University. And so not only did my department not exist when I got there, my position did not exist. So I was the department of one in a department called Academic Affairs that no one understood, that's meant to be a kind of a liaison between those worlds. So that's a little bit of how, and so I was invited to apply for that role, but other people applied, like, don't think it was just a, hey, Kijo, you want this? No, but it was because of the sort of the broad ways that I think, but I think also the ways that I'm willing to sort of jump into conversations about things that I just out of interest, that's enough. Is that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Can And so you started this department of one, as you
Yes.
and that was back in 2017. And how
Yes.
has that been going? What's happening now? What have you been up to?
So there were some major transformations because it was immediately, it was houses all of the internships and fellowships, so administers all of those for the museum, but also symposia and colloquia, but also scheduling tours and classrooms and all of those sorts of things. And so it has transformed in that we're now a department of two. But the most significant change has been, I did the same thing at the CMA. I just talked about the things I was interested in, collaborated with folks, even if they didn't know they wanted to collaborate with me yet. Now, and I think also the world changed fairly significantly in the last couple of years, not the least making museums have a kind of existential crisis, not even kind of, facing an existential crisis. And there were a series of internal conversations that happened at the CMA where we were able to be really transparent about the problems that we understood, not just in the world and the structure of the museum, but for ourselves and the work that we do. And I expressed that I felt creatively stifled and that I wasn't being my ideas around creating exhibitions or how we might engage the public in these headier questions were not being engaged, and that there was a strange barrier that was erected between education and curatorial. And that's part of the issue, that we can talk about DEAI, but if you aren't giving Black and Brown folks the space and opportunity to do the work that they might do best, then it's merely speech. And so following that, I was asked what would I like my role to look like. And I am committed to this sort of hybrid understanding of how we can create transformational experiences with and through works of art. And so the new role, even though the title is so incredibly clunky and long, marries the visioning for creating career pathways and opportunities for students, but also research and residency opportunities, research-based residency opportunities for both scholars and artists at the museum, as well as developing exhibition and publication projects that are meant to be at that nexus. How do you make a scholarly publication accessible broadly, right? So I'm throwing in ideas like, can we have teaching legends? Like, how would you teach this thick concept to a third grader? Can we have an activities book? Is there a way that we can develop companions for these? How do we do that? How do we, in an exhibition, allow for validate those serendipitous experiences you might have by wandering around a museum and you see something orange in one spot and something orange in another spot, and it speaks to you, and there might not be a clear art historical beautiful story to tell right then, but that should be enough. How do we validate that in our interpretations, in our response state? How do we do that, and how do we involve students in that process, because they can tell us also how we might do so. So yeah, I think that is where we are now. So I will have 2 exhibitions and a multi-authored publication emerging in 2022. One that is sort of conceived of out of ideas that are affiliated with my dissertation and long-standing thinking about Black art and what happens if we put it in the center. But the other is in collaboration with a public art research lab out of Philadelphia called Monument Lab. And it is meant to model what it looks like when you absorb community input, create an exhibition, but there will also be 2 symposia around it. We won't need to talk about it that much. There will be more information coming out about it later. But the idea is that there is long-term community engagement leading up to the creation of a temporary monument that will be on the CMA's campus, that embedded in it is public engagement and capturing of community voice. And then it's bookended by an introductory symposium and then a culminating symposium that will be a summary of findings. So not only will we say thank you for giving us your input, but here's what we did with it, which is where I think a lot of museums lose the thread. We have focus groups and do all of that legwork, but where do those folks see their words, their ideas in the text or in the show that emerges? So the idea is to bring down some of those boundaries and be very clear about where we utilized their input and where we may not.
This is an amazing and such a generative response. I remember you gave a talk at the Department of the History of Art not long ago, and I was struck by how rigorously theoretical your research is and your dissertation is. And now you're describing this incredible process by which you're taking the work from that dissertation and really leading up to the most public form of engagement possible. And monuments have been at the forefront of conversation in America throughout the last year. I wonder if you can share some specifics about what this whole project will look like. I know you said some of it is very tentative, but if there are any particular things that you can share with us today.
Sure. So we are still, so what I will share in the as a mode of transparency is we are still finalizing contracts and things because this is a very new model for an encyclopedic museum like ours, or at least for the CMA, in that the Monument Lab, which if you don't know about them, you should look them up. It's just monumentlab.com, no S monument. And they are one of the recipients of the new public monuments funding from the Mellon Foundation. So they will be conducting a national audit of monuments. And we don't know what they're calling a prototype monument will look like. But what this thing is meant to do is to make visible the transience of monuments, right? So how can we unhook the idea of monuments with everlasting? Because we sort of play at the idea when there's a desire for a monument to change, there's all of a sudden this idea that this is our heritage and it never changes. And we're like, but no, building names and things change all the time. Money makes the world go round. And so it's meant to do that. There was some, let me take one step back. Pre-pandemic, our notion was to utilize a process that Monument Lab has developed over time, in which they actually train community researchers to create pods in neighborhoods, in cities, that collect proposals for what do you think is a proper monument for your contemporary city. And then they take those paper proposals, which they get any number of things from writing to drawings of imagined monuments, and they create things like actual maps folded like a city map that on the terrain of that city place those imagined monuments, or a digitized version of all of the proposals that came in, a report to the city about how they might rethink that landscape of monuments based on their community's input. But then Corona had her own ideas And so we shifted to this idea where Monument Lab themselves, so Paul Farber, who is the director, and Ken Lum, who's the artistic director and primary curator, and they work with a cadre of different nationally known and internationally known artists. They will come and visit Cleveland. We set up interactions and moments of contact with tons of our community partners, everyone from our protection services guards through our board on staff, also though students, community members who regularly come to the museum and those who don't. We have a partnership with the public library so that we can have regular conversations with the students and teachers and community members who go there. And they are going to then metabolize that into creating whatever that monument will look like. So that part I don't know. But I will say that they had ideas of thinking about like Speaker's Corner in Britain, a place where, or like something where anyone's voice could be amplified. So there are lots of, but it will depend, because what they'll also be doing when they do a series of visits starting in April is scouting, walking around the space, getting a feel for what and where it might be most appropriate, and go from there. But all the time they will be documenting whatever input they're receiving, and working with folks in our research and evaluation department to think about how, when we program it over the summer of 22, what that looks like, and how do we make all of that data really vibrant and present.
What I love about, how you describe this is it is so very participatory. It brings in not just the public, but also other organizations, workspaces, project spaces of all different kinds. And it's very collaborative. It's very participatory. And this kind of leads me back. So as I near the completion of my PhD, I am looking forward to a curatorial career. And like you, I am also committed to combining curatorial work with the work of education, because one of the reasons I decided to go into curatorial work is because it allows me to connect art with public audiences in a way that is done differently within the academic art historical context. And you mentioned this earlier, and I have also found it to be true, that at many museums and institutions, curatorial and educational work are held separate. And it never really made a lot of sense to me. Like, why would that be considered separate? And what I find in the work that you're doing there, in this project that you're working on, is you're not just pushing against that artificial division. You're actually kind of modeling ways in which educational work and curatorial work can be combined in an organic way. Like going forward, they can kind of create a kind of synergy and really kind of bounce off of each other. So my question to you is, at a time when we're talking so much about, well, how do museums, where do museums go from here? The questions and conversations that have started over the last year have made it clear that we can't go back to business as usual. It's just not tenable. I remember feeling shocked when, at the height of the pandemic here in New York, MoMa let go of all of its educational staff. I thought it was a horrible example to set. What you're doing, what your practice kind of makes clear, is that museums can do so much more by working more closely with their educational potential, by realizing that potential. And I wonder if you think that this also kind of necessitates a rethinking of the curatorial model, the way the curators are trained, where you basically do a PhD and then you're hired on the strength of that. But we don't tend to talk much about, can curators also teach the arts? I'm curious about your thoughts on this. I mean, I have a sense of it, but I want to hear it.
Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. I think that there has to be a shift in both curatorial, but also in museum education training, right? Because I think that there's this hierarchy that's inherent to museums, that's inherent to the academy, that places whatever, an MA above a BA, PhD above them all, and then the ways in which the training, the pedagogy in art history versus museum education, they diverge, even though they're navigating around the exact same objects. So I think that, yes, there has to be one of my preoccupations in thinking about internships and fellowships is, are we creating the training opportunities that are training folks for positions like the one that I have, right? So I don't want to be mealy-mouthed about the fact that the reason that my position works is because I am trained in museum education and trained in art history in very rigorous ways. And so it makes it relatively easy for me to see those synergies. But if you've never looked at a book called Museum Gallery Activities, right, which describes VTS, or which describes the exact nuts and bolts to how you get an audience to talk about a work, to create a poem together, right? Then it can seem like then it doesn't become part of your thinking when you're considering your wall text or considering how it is that you are going to convey the story to your audience. So I think that adding, just like connoisseurship or the close study of objects has been, or technical art history is being incorporated or reincorporated into art history grad programs, I think that museum education shouldn't be necessarily elective, right? I think that there should be at least some kind of class or set of classes that actually teaches you how to teach about art. But I also think on the other side, because I think that there can be a sensibility from museum educators that art historians are know-it-alls, and we are, but we're also trained to be so. But that we fail to convey what we think we're doing. So the specificity of words, the like gorgeousness of rolling around these terms, but then not taking a moment to break the frame, explain the term, and then move on. So there are these ways in which, but there's a richness that comes. And there's a reason that audiences like to float away with curators on these stories that they tell in their gallery talks. So I find that what becomes beautiful is the effective blending of that. So I think that there has to be a shift so that we're creating that training is hybrid, such that these positions don't become so strange. Or if you're in a traditional curatorial position, you still have an understanding of museum education, so you can talk to the educators, and rather than treating them as though they are service providers, that they're the ones that are going to translate your really good ideas for the kids, you can actually collaborate, and vice versa. Museum educators can feel validated in their understanding of archival research, for instance, such that they can think about how you take the experience of going into an archive, if that's part of the story that someone's trying to tell, and translate that. And then also, honestly, it's just comporting oneself to an openness to be moved that someone else may know something different, and it doesn't make the idea better or worse. So I think that I know myself as an academic, I'll only speak for me. I get very wrapped up in my ideas. They become very part of me. And so it takes a training, a personal training toward openness, to not only hearing what someone else is saying to you or a colleague, but to be moved by it and to try it, right? To allow the possibility that the idea that you have may not be perfectly conveyed, but may be more effectively conveyed by working across or in between.
I love this. Sorry, I am battling a cold, so if my voice sounds weird, I apologize. But Kijo, I love this talk about the affective texture of the museum experience. You know, there is right now we're all talking about NFTs and blockchain. And I confess I don't really understand it, and I'm not sure anybody else does. But I have always thought that there is something to being present in the museum before the artwork that is not just about the aura of the object, but actually being there before the work. And to be part of the conversations that one may overhear in the gallery. And, you know, it is striking how you can just kind of stand in front of one object and just listen to different people come by, talk about that same object, and they're going to say different things. And it all kind of adds up to this kind of polyvocal textured description. And the reason I think about this is that one of the lines of critique that has become very powerful over the last year is the angle of abolitionism. There are those who would say that the museum, because it is so irrevocably bound up with its colonial imperial origins as the repository of stolen goods, cultural artifacts, things that have been unhomed and ripped out of their original context, and now they've been laid out in this very sanitized white gallery. There is no hope for the museum. And I find that I am somewhat ambivalent about this position. I hear what they're saying. At the same time, you know, I also hear what one of my mentors, Thomas Lax, curator of media performance at MoMa, he used to talk about how you know, you can work inside of an institution while also working to kind of turn it inside out, to use those institutional resources and use them to do the work that you need to do. And what you were talking about, you know, is in many ways, it is about that. It is about working to build new models, working to create a different pipeline. Because I keep going back to that thing you were saying about listening to what other people have to say. But if those other people all come from similar kinds of backgrounds, similar kinds of training, if they all look a certain way, then you're just going to hear the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
So I think what we're getting at here is like the bones of the matter, structural transformation. And I want to say I'm optimistic, and I want to think that you are also optimistic about, you know, what can we do to remake the institution. And I wonder what you think about, you know, how do we keep this momentum going?
Yeah. So thinking about, you know, terminology, I struggle with optimism because I think that I'm a realist. And I want to give credit to a really good friend that I've made since I lived in Cleveland, an artist named M. Carmen Lane. And they often tell me that white supremacy is a distraction from my work, which is a paraphrase of Toni Morrison. And so I think that if you had asked me this question even 10 years ago, I would probably have been more on the edge of just burn all the shit down, like burn this shit down and start all over again. I think that I am in the place of I will fight tooth and nail to make spaces of liberation for all of the folks who will break, right? Whose imaginations may be more advanced than my own, right? I admit to my own failure of imagining what it looks like after we burn it down. And there is something I cannot, and I will also cop to the self-centeredness of my entanglement with museums, because they have generated so much intellectual fervor and work, like on the ground work, in, I hope, helping to, I don't even want to, even the words like I move the needle, the progressive change, I don't know, because I don't know that the structure can be changed. That's why I don't know about that, because what we've witnessed time and again is the harder you push, you can make a fissure. And then there is a, immediate attempt to putty, but that putty is never complete, right? And so I think for me, it was more about gaining the satisfaction of making the fissure rather than knocking the thing down. But I am ambivalent deeply because of my connection to incredible activist scholars for whom, if it doesn't work and they are leaving, right? And I lament that, because to me it is necessary. And maybe that's what the museum, and that's what museums and the academy need, is for the brilliance to leave en masse. But I guess I'm not in the place where I am willing to relinquish those transformative potential there, and to consider those individual freedoms that I've seen created out of making those fissures. So I don't think we're saying anything different. I think, though, that I struggle, having now been through, or having now been witness to, right, where our desires for DEAI can work and where they don't, and where I'm sick of saying DEAI because it's now been defanged, and where I'm like, if anyone says amplify voices one more time, my head is gonna pop off. Because can we just, rather than having the language of it, just do that? But I don't want to make claims that means that the museum will be something different, that it won't still be a repository of works that were gained based on violence, privilege. That I cannot say, right? And is the way out blockchain, NFTs, whatever? I don't know. But I hope I'm dead before it happens, because I can't think about it, at least not now. And it makes me feel very old. But I'm also like, I just don't understand it. And it seems like a whole nother language. And I got out of German on purpose. So
But I do love what you said about the idea of making fissures.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that line from Leonard Cohen. There's a crack in everything, and that's where the light gets in.
Yeah.
I wonder if right now the most we can do is to keep making those cracks and see what gets in.
And demand, like I asked that I not be asked to be on any more DEAI committees. That is not my work. I'm not trained to train people on how to understand race, gender, intersectionality, I'm certainly uninterested in training, in educating already educated people about that. So I'm trying to find my own liberation in the space of the museum and to make demands to protect that. So I guess that's what I'm thinking, is modeling that, right? So training the ear of the executive team such that if they hear y'all in a sentence or some other AAVE, that their ear is trained to hear the brilliance that's wrapped in that brilliant language, so that the next kid that comes from a place that is saying something brilliant, just not in the way that their ear is trained to hear it, it doesn't get lost. It's expanding the set of resources and references that my colleagues use when they're thinking about their work, right? So suggesting Sadia Hartman or Christina Sharp or Kobina Mercer when someone is thinking about Richard Ryman, or thinking about, not only Black diasporic artists. How can you broaden the scholarly resources that you're attending to? So these are the things that, because I don't know, to quote another great woman, if the master's tools can dismantle the master's house, but I can damn sure bang a hole with that hammer. I might not be able to take the whole thing down, but we shall see.
Hey, Jill, thank you for sharing so many of your thoughts and an insight into your practice. I think it's, really inspirational, the work that you're doing right now. And also, while resisting what you rightly noted, is the distraction of, constantly being charged with educating people who really should know better, frankly.
And there are people who are willing and able and delighted to do that work. So my thing is, use the resources of the museum to pay someone to do that. And that is the other trick, is I use the resources of my museum to pay, like making it so that there are no unpaid internships. That's one way that we can, so there are those, various ways that we can think about it. So yeah.
I am opening this up to the floor for any questions, comments. If anybody wants to share anything, you can either post it in the chat or in the Q&A box.
How important is to you how your project is funded? That's a really interesting question, Tom. So it's interesting because in my department, there were certain pre-existing endowments and grants that I, to be really frank, haven't researched the families from whence they come. But I will say that for the exhibition and the exhibitions and the publication that are coming, I have been very clear that I would like to know every single sort of grant that we're writing for, where is it coming from? And we work for exhibitions and such primarily with foundations. So it's a little bit less, it's still sticky, but it's a little bit less sticky than individual donations. But we have, but that is a really good question, and something that I'm going to add to my own thinking more readily. Thank you for that.
I also have a question here in the Q&A from Matthew O'Malley. Dear Keijo, thank you so much for being here and catching us up in New Haven about your crucial work in Cleveland. Question, what are you reading and listening to these days?
Oh gosh. So what am I reading? Right now, I am rereading Travel and Sea by Kobina Mercer. I am reading Exhibiting Blackness. Sorry, I'm just gonna go ahead. Oh, I'm reading, if you haven't read this yet, The Poetical Wager by Joan Redelac. It is fascinating. It's this idea about an ethical poetics. Fabulous. What am I listening to? I listen to a lot of instrumental music because I'm trying to write. So, and I listen to a podcast by a meditation specialist named Tara Brach. So part of that practice I was talking about of comporting oneself to openness, it is a lot having to do with my own meditation practice, which I found has helped my scholarly practice. Was that I think that, does that answer? Yeah. Sorry. Oh. Yeah, I know, it's so good. A friend of mine, Andrea Hickey, curated a whole show around this book called A Poetical Wager a couple of years ago at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland. And that's when I got introduced to this work. And I find it really, really interesting. Oh, and I'm also reading Glitch Feminism.
I'd actually been meaning to read that, Glitch Feminism. How are you finding it?
I mean, I had to put it to the side because I was reading too many things at once. But so yeah, I don't want to make a comment yet. But I've heard that it's excellent from people that I really value their opinion.
I've heard really good things about it too.
Yes. Share with second language acquisition instructors and museum projects. So so as far as having second language instructors participate in museum projects and or create interpretive text, I guess I'm wondering maybe if you could give me, Rosemaria, a little bit more information about what you're thinking, because what immediately came to my mind were things like creating, how do we share information across languages? How do we, I'm so sorry. Rosemaria asked, any experience you could share with second language acquisition instructors and museum projects? And I was just asking if there was a way, if they might like to add a little bit more to that question, because what I was thinking immediately was, how do we make sure that we are conveying the same kind, putting the same kind of energy toward non-English speaking audiences, but also getting their input. Is that, and if that is the question, then we are working on that now. So one of the things that made me, one of the things that we had been working on pre-pandemic was having a group of facilitators, whether they be tour guides, gallery teachers, and such, that were fluent in Spanish, in Mandarin, in and in American Sign Language, and we were working actually with 2 local ASL programs, training programs, for facilitating that, as far as having that input when it comes to developing exhibitions. With Monument Lab, we have a set of gallery teachers that will work closely with them, who are fluent in multiple languages, that will help them to engage non-English speaking local folks. One of the things and then for the exhibition, which is called Currents and Constellations, that's on Black art. With that, one of the things that I've been suggesting or thinking about is, how do we have multiple translations of wall text? because I'm also interested in that as a form, because the ways that, you know, my eye as a curator is like as much room to breathe for the artwork as possible. But I'm like, what would it look like if we translated every wall text into 50 languages? And there was one object on every wall and it was just surrounded by all of that text. What might happen? I'm sorry, I'm going very far afield. You're witnessing how my brain works in real time. But yeah, so I hope that that gets a little bit at what your question is. I apologize if I'm not addressing it as directly as I could be. Oh, I see a question from Keely. Are there any museums that you think have been effective in blending curatorial and education work? Actually, Columbus Museum of Art. And I think that that's because their director started as a museum educator, became a director of education, and then became a museum director. There's really a full, there's an education corridor there where there are plinths and wall ledges for visitor created artworks. So you get prompts and things, and then you can actually place the work, but there's also educator curated shows. It's where the most touchable things are. So that's one place that's doing, I think, a really amazing job.
We have a question from Emily Sessions. Hi, Emily. Thank you both for a fantastic talk, truly amazing. Kijo, has working through COVID times and our online world now made you think any differently or surprised you or expanded your sense of the possibilities of museums and the puppets? Open-ended, I know, but would love any thoughts.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I am a person whose method has always depended on being right in front of the work and talking about it and this and that, which we could not do. And so what's been really exciting is seeing through a set of virtual programs that I hosted called Close Looking at a Distance. And because of, I also want to admit to the fact that we had an embarrassment of riches, kind of like at Yale. So our collections online, they use photogrammetry on some things, but anything that has supporting information is fully Zoomable. Actually, I'll share a thing. And so what I've been delighted with is the fact that what we can show are things that aren't on view currently or nearly ever. Can you see a picture of Lorna Simpson image? So with these, you can get incredibly close. This is a photograph, so it's probably not the best selection. And show folks things that are not on view. And also, it helped me to think more deeply about accessibility. So I've had the opportunity to sit in on and have conversations with multiple disability studies scholars. And they helped me to see how my demand to be in the museum is a barrier in so many ways for so many different kinds of access. So it's been incredibly pivotal to also see that we could do it, and that we could do it in a way that isn't maybe as natural as being in a gallery where I can look at someone's body language, study their movements, see that whether or not they want to say anything. But what I found was speaking conversationally into this screen gave people permission to also do that, and building activities into that conversation, asking for responses was really helpful. So it's something that I hope that we continue. I've even suggested that we ensure that any gallery talks that we schedule or any kind of even close looking programs that we do, if we could figure out a way to live stream them so that there's somebody who is navigating and also asking questions. It's the same thing that we do in the galleries with folks who maybe have low vision, right? We narrate. So I think that we can, so it definitely expanded my idea about how we can engage folks in close looking.
I just want to, piggyback off of that, just give a shout out to the Yale Art Gallery. I had the experience of being a TF for a course on ancient Greek art last fall for like 300 students. And the Yale Art Gallery was amazing in kind of digitizing their objects and putting them, making videos of them, making, clothes photography. It was certainly a whole other experience. We have a question from Matt Jacobson. Do you think it's possible that a language of ethics could be more generative, more buy-in, less pushback than our common language of politics in institutional settings? Museums, for sure, but I'm thinking of universities too.
Yes, absolutely. I think that it's a must, right? I think that, so again, I sometimes think about it as maybe it's I'm just getting older or whatever. Maybe that's too cliche. But I can remember railing, right, against the powers that be at Yale, just mad about injustice. And my now late partner Barney used to say to me, "But who are you mad at? And how would you talk to them if you were in a room with them right now? And could you find out with whom you should be mad about this particular thing," right? And so I think that that's gave me this hint around calling in. I'll give one other scenario that I think could be applied, right? So I think that there has to be a shift toward an opening to rather than a pushing against, as Matt is saying. And so I think that in some ways, people have said to me all my life, well, you have to always consider class when you're thinking about race and this, and I understood that intellectually, of course. And in so many other ways. I went on a sort of impromptu road trip through West Virginia, and I was in a place and I saw a kind of poverty that I don't think I've ever witnessed quite up close in a rural setting, I will say, right? So here in Cleveland, we have a neighborhood called East Cleveland where there's no broadband access. There's, each neighborhood in Cleveland has a community development corporation that manages its taxes and infrastructure and this and that. But if you don't have any money, then you don't collect any taxes, and therefore you have no infrastructure. And all I kept thinking when I was in this little town in West Virginia was, if we could put a split screen between the abject poverty in these two spaces, we can see who's the real problem here. And part of it is me. I'm part of that problem, right? So it's the openness of how can we bring ourselves into and up against the problems that we might be complicit in as well, and have it feel like an invitation to expansion rather than an invitation to annihilation, if that makes sense. And I think it is absolutely possible, but I think it's in the way that we comport ourselves and the way that we receive that ends up transforming how other people receive us. I really do. And that doesn't mean turn the other cheek or take a whole bunch of nonsense and mess, but I think in the bigger sense, it is, how can we position it such that it is the response to it's you is, well, maybe it is me. And how can I consider that?
I think that's a very generous and generative response. And it also echoes what some of my best curatorial mentors have said about the willingness to listen rather than to, assert your point of view or your narrative. I see we don't have any further questions, and we're over 5 p.m. So I think we're going to wrap it up here. Keijo, thank you again so much for sharing your time with us and for making space for this conversation. And thank you to everyone else for being here.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for the questions and comments. Thank you. And thanks so much, Swagato. Oh, Matt raised his hand, or no? Did he put it back down?
No. Yeah,
Maybe
no,
it's down again. Okay.
Okay, we're good.
Good to see you. Thanks, Cynthia. Thanks, Keely. Thanks everybody for being here.